Hello, everyone, and welcome to our first ever HR Exchange Live Diversity and Inclusion online event. My name is David Rice, and I am the editor of the HR Exchange Network, as well as your host for the day. I'm glad you've decided to join us for this one. We've got some great speakers that are going to be talking about some important issues surrounding what I think we can all agree is a vitally important issue for our workplaces and for society as a whole. Before we get started, I just want to run through a couple of housekeeping items. First, should you encounter any technical issues today, feel free to reach out to us under the Help tab in the chat function. You'll see two tabs for chat, one for help. I'd like to keep the questions for our speakers in the chat tab and the technical questions in the Help tab if we can help it. It'll just make it a lot easier for me when we get to the Q&A portion to ensure that I don't miss any of your questions. As always, you can earn SHRM credit for live attendance at today's sessions. Details on how to redeem those will go out after the event has concluded, so be on the lookout for that in your inbox, probably late today or tomorrow. So with that out of the way, I'd like to introduce our first pair of speakers for a session titled Occupational Mobility and the Drive Toward an Equitable Workforce Recovery After COVID-19. To lead us in this discussion, we are joined by Ashley Putnam. She is the Director of Economic Growth and Mobility, the Economic Growth and Mobility Project at the Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia, and she has with her Keith Wardrop. He is a Community Development Research Manager at the Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia. So Ashley, Keith, welcome. Take it away.
Great. Well, thanks so much for having us, David. I'm going to kick us off talking a little bit about what do we mean by equitable workforce development, but just want to say I'm really thrilled to be here and be speaking with human resources professionals and really sharing some of the work that we do at the Philly Fed. So I'm going to share this presentation here to get us started. And just kind of explain a little bit more also about what we do and where this research comes from, and honestly, why we think it matters both for the work that you do, but also for the economy more largely. So as we said before, I lead this strategic initiative that was started very recently at the Philly Fed, I guess now 3 years, called the Economic Growth. I do also have to start with our standard Fed disclaimer. Please know that my views here today are mine alone and do not necessarily reflect the views of the Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia or the Federal Reserve System. So now that that is over, one of the questions I get when we start talking about this is, why does the Federal Reserve care about economic mobility? And the answer is really twofold here. We do have a dual mandate at the Fed to both maximize employment and ensure price stability. And this is obviously a conversation we're having now that's really critical to our economic recovery. So when we think about that maximizing employment side of that, that really means that we have to think about all of the barriers that we have in place that are keeping people from obtaining their maximum potential in terms of connecting to work and moving up the economic ladder. So I really focus on 3 different things here. I talk about infrastructure, transportation, childcare, broadband access. I talk a lot about workforce development, which is what we're going to dig in today. And we also focus on some work around job creation and economic development. And this is really our recipe for thinking about an inclusive recovery and how we need to think about reaching our full economic potential. So today I'm going to lean in more to some of the work we do on workforce development, which really segs into some of the work that my colleague Keith has done and just some incredible and important research. But very quickly, as a means of definition, I know I'm speaking today with human resources professionals, and sometimes the word workforce development is used in different contexts. So, we use this to describe a variety of activities, policies, and programs that invest in talent. So Keith and I may often talk about workforce development in reference to sort of government-funded training programs, nonprofit organizations, community colleges, and other investments into sort of a region's economic and workforce development. For individual organizations, however, we're often talking about this in terms of your investments in your own workforce. So that may be upskilling, reskilling, how you think about your talent pipelines, how you think about who you're bringing on, and your strategies to career pathways. So the reason I make this in the macro and the micro is because human resources professionals are such a critical part of our workforce development system. So we're really excited today to share with you some of the work we're doing and some of the things we're thinking about. Obviously, we know we are at a critical moment for our economy. We have a lot of things that are happening right now that are impacting workers. Prior to this moment in time, we saw increasing income inequality, we saw automation and changes in work and what work looks like. And now we also have things like the business closures, layoffs, funding shortages in governments as a result of the pandemic, and really uncertainty about the future and jobs. And so this is how we kind of got into this question about, well, what do we need to do to really think about an equitable recovery for workers? So again, COVID-19 is obviously a challenge, not shocking to any of you, and many things you've probably seen in the news, but really particularly as it has amplified things like wage disparities, job loss disparities. We still see greater rates of unemployment in Black and Hispanic communities, as well as women who have left the workforce and maybe don't even show up in some of our unemployment numbers because they've stopped looking for work. We also have seen historically that there are really uneven recoveries. Black and Hispanic workers, women, and particularly those without a college degree are often slower to regain employment and rebuild assets. So this was something that was a big concern for us at the Philadelphia Fed when we started thinking about building an inclusive recovery. We also know that automation is a problem that has persisted prior to this moment. This is some work that our colleague Lei Ding led a couple years ago that was really looking at what jobs were going to be impacted by automation. And he has a subsequent report that got published that looked at some ways where COVID-19 has actually accelerated some of these trends. So you see the impact on lower wage workers and lower skilled workers. And so one of the things we really started to ask is, well, who is going to be most impacted by some of these trends? And what we see here is that it is predominantly falling on jobs that are held by people of color, jobs that are held by women, and jobs that are held by younger and older workers. And so again, when we talk about the future of work, for us, we really need to think about this with a racial and gender equity lens. So why equity and recovery? Why does this matter? Can't we just go back to normal and things will be great? Well, one of the concerns we have is really preventing these long-term dislocations of workers that could extend our economic crisis and really could exacerbate some of these labor market inequalities that we've seen historically. We know that if we do not pursue an equitable workforce recovery, that there are a proportion of Black, brown, and women workers who may suffer long-term dislocations. And that this is actually a conversation about our economy at large. Our colleagues at the San Francisco Fed found that we could be adding $2.6 trillion to our economy, to our GDP, if we were to address some of these disparities, racial and gender disparities in our labor market. So this is about our collective benefit. So very quickly, as another definition here, we do talk a lot about equity. For those of you who are not familiar, and I'm sure as HR professionals, many of you have seen this, there is a difference in this conversation between equity and equality. And equality for us is really everybody on the left kind of getting the same treatment. Equity being that the people who have been historically disenfranchised are getting specific treatments that are focused on helping elevate them. And in this third image, which I think is really what we're aiming for, we think about how we remove those barriers so that we are really addressing some of those root causes of the systems that have led us to this place where we see different outcomes. So what is a recovery and what is an equitable recovery? And again, why does this matter? First, we're trying to get beyond this, getting back to normal, into thinking about, our economy has not been working well for everyone. What does a new normal look like? How do we build that? How do we facilitate that together? The second is this kind of attitude we've often had in recovery that if people get a job, any job, they will find a better one later. And I think this is really the crux of the discussion today, is what role can we play and what role can human resources and workforce development professionals play in helping people move up that economic ladder? And really thinking about connecting people to jobs that provide upward mobility. And finally, this kind of assumption that when the economy recovers, all workers are going to be able to reconnect. One of the things we've really seen highlighted in this moment is the importance of wraparound supports, things like access to broadband internet, as we are connected today, talking digitally and virtually, right? But also things like access to transportation, access to quality and affordable childcare. These are really critical issues that could prevent workers from being able to reconnect and get back into the labor market. And finally, that we often put the onus on individuals to be responsible for their own training and skill development. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, but kind of today we want to challenge the role that we can play in thinking about new types of partnerships. How do we build new pathways where we're working with government, with employers, really across sectors to ensure that individuals are able to reach their maximum potential? So this is our definition at the Philly Fed of what an equitable workforce recovery is. So now we know what we together on these issues. But we really define this as a recovery that acknowledges and examines root causes of employment disparities, that targets those interventions to populations disproportionately impacted, again, the difference between equity and equality, that removes barriers to work, to training, to that encourage quality supports workers so that workers can make decisions and have the most agency over their lives and their choices. And then really today our focus is about that increasing access to career pathways that lead to financial stability. So what can we do? Is really the question here. And I think my colleague Keith will get into this a little bit more. But we really have three things we focused on. The first is barriers. The second is addressing bias in hiring. We're going to talk a little bit about that and how it connects to Keith's work. And the final, pathways to mobility. So again, what do I mean by barriers? I mean everything from infrastructure, the actual hard line, do I have a highway or public transit to get into and out of my workplace, to other things like broadband internet or digital literacy. We also know that childcare remains a major barrier for many to return to work, and we are seeing that particularly in this moment in time in our economy. So both cost and access are equity issues and one of the barriers to work. We also know that, as we've seen in previous recoveries, individuals without four-year degrees have really been disproportionately impacted. And we are seeing those numbers, again, highlighted in this moment in time, where we do see the recovery happening for degree holders or people with professional levels of certifications are really bouncing back very quickly. And those without four-year college degrees are really struggling to reconnect. And so one of the things we really want to think about is, what are the ways that low-wage workers are not necessarily low-skilled workers? What are the skills that they have that are beyond that four-year credential? We know there's critical competencies in almost every single job, everything from customer service to communication. And those are really important possibilities for employers to leverage those talents that are often left out. So we've been thinking a lot about removing degree requirements, thinking about competency-based or skills-based assessments, and how you as HR professionals can ensure that you're really accessing the best possible talent pipeline. And finally, we think a lot about these fostering pathways to mobility. And this is, I think, what Keith is going to lean into a little bit more. But again, the one thing is opening the door. The next thing is building the ladder. So we want to make sure we're opening the door to people of all different backgrounds. We know that when you are filtering for a four-year college degree, you are leaving behind a large number of people who really could be potentially competitive in your workforce. But really one of the questions I'm sure you all think about a lot is, well, what happens once we get there? And so this is really the work that Keith has led on occupational mobility, where we see this high degree of similarity in skills between lower wage work and what we call opportunity occupations. And again, Keith will talk about this more. But one of the things I want to challenge us to think about is how we can partner better with private and public institutions to reduce risk to workers for some of those transitions. So maybe you're in a job, that job may be automating, or that job may be a job that is really not where you want to stay. And so how do we think about those kinds of transitions both inside and outside of our organization? And that's really my challenge today is how to think about those career pathways. How do you invest in reskilling and upskilling? And how do you identify those critical competencies and then the ones that they maybe need to move up the ladder to that next set of occupations? So I've said all of these things and I am going to transition, but I do want to challenge us today. One of the things that is a connecting theme for us and something we've really come to realize in this moment is the importance of our conversations about workers. We often speak about our job seekers in kind of deficit language, right? So we'll say, oh, this is a low-skilled worker. And what we're realizing is that people have different skills, and they may not always be marked by a traditional four-year degree or even some of the credentials that we often seek and when we're looking at resumes. And so we're really encouraging folks ourselves, and I encourage all of you today listening, how we can change our narratives so that we make sure that we're not talking about workers in deficit language, but thinking about our people as our greatest asset. I know that collectively as human resources professionals, this is what you do all the time. And so I encourage you to think about how your organization is participating in this and thinking about the role you play, not just for your organization, but for the economy at large, to really build a more resilient and inclusive future of work. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Keith, who's going to share with you beyond this kind of theory of change, what does the how look like? What does it mean to actually do this? So thanks for listening to how we think about equitable recovery for workers. And excited to turn it over to Keith to tell you about the research and tools that he has.
Great, thank you so much, Ashley. I'm going to share my screen now. Well, again, thanks, Ashley, and hello to everyone out there. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak today. And I also appreciate, Ashley, the overview that you gave of what an equitable workforce recovery looks like, especially the role that you see for career pathways. I think it's a really nice segue to talk about some research and a tool that my colleagues and I produced to explore, as this title slide suggests, what we call a skills-based approach to occupational mobility. Stop me if you've heard of this one, but like Ashley, I do need to mention that my views are not necessarily those of the Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia or the Federal Reserve System. But let's talk for just a second about why we undertook a study of occupational mobility in the first place. So in 2019, some colleagues and I conducted some research into the employment opportunities facing non-college workers across the US. And really what we wanted to know is what share of jobs for non-college workers and which jobs specifically paid decent wages for those without a bachelor's degree. And we coined the term opportunity employment to describe those jobs. So jobs that are accessible to workers without a bachelor's degree and that typically pay above the national annual median wage. And what we found is that just under 22% of all metropolitan area employment meets that definition, and that some of the largest opportunity occupations, especially those in healthcare and the skilled trades, were expected to experience above average growth in the coming years. But I think we all know that some workers get stuck in low wage jobs. And the chart on the next slide illustrates what I think a lot of us know intuitively, that Ashley alluded to as well, that women and workers of color are more likely to hold these lower wage jobs than are white workers and men. So this slide shows the 10 largest occupations in the US with median weekly earnings below $600, or roughly $15 per hour if you work full time. And the circles show the over or under representation of women and Black and Hispanic workers in each occupation. If the circle's at 0%, it means that the share of workers in the job is equal to the share of workers in the labor force. So for example, if you look at nursing assistants, the highest circle is colored light blue, representing Black workers. For nursing assistants, you can see it's at nearly 200%. That's because Black workers represent around 12% force, but around 35% of nursing assistants. So they're overrepresented by almost 200%. You know, the location of the specific circles and the exact percentages don't matter. What matters, and what I hope you take away from this slide, are that nearly all of the circles are above 0%, which means that in almost every case, women and workers of color are overrepresented in the 10 largest low-wage jobs in the US. So just to quickly summarize my first two slides, we know that there's a slice of the economy that pays decent wages and without requiring a bachelor's degree. We know that women and workers of color are disproportionately likely to be employed in the largest lower wage occupations. And we know from prior research that those employed in. So the next natural question for us and maybe for you is, how can we create pathways into better paying jobs, into these opportunity occupations for workers without a bachelor's degree? And how can workers leverage the skills they've developed through prior work experience to advance into these careers? So we started the research I'm about to present in late 2019, and unemployment was at 3.5%. It was a very different economy, but we think our findings are increasingly relevant today, maybe for different reasons. So millions of people are out of work, and you've probably seen surveys that suggest that a lot of workers are considering whether or not to return to their jobs, right? They may be taking the opportunity to change fields, maybe because of they're concerned their jobs aren't coming back, maybe because there are health concerns in the workplace. It might be that they've just have had time for reflection. Just like before the pandemic, we're also hearing from employers about difficulty filling open positions. That might be something you're experiencing yourself. And we hope that this research and the tool could help hiring managers tap into new sources of talent. And I think, as this chart indicates, you know, the implications for workplace diversity, equity, inclusion couldn't be clearer. So I'd like to talk for just a minute about how we conducted this research. So at its core, we think of an occupation, your job, my job, as just a collection or a bundle of tasks that a worker has to complete. You have to do different things in your job than I have to do, and what really differentiates my job from yours are the skills that I need to do my tasks and the skills that you need to do yours. So with that in mind, with that framing in mind, we analyze tens of millions of online job advertisements in the 33 largest metros in the US. And we focus on the 25 skills most often requested by employers in each metro. And so our entire research approach sort of hinges on this notion that these 25 skills define an occupation in a given labor market. And what we do from there is we compare these skill sets for every lower wage and every opportunity occupation in each metro. But we focus on potential transitions that would allow a worker to receive at least a 10% pay increase and a transition that would not require a bachelor's degree. And then for each of those pairs, we calculate a similarity score that measures the degree to which a pair of occupations requires a similar skill set at a similar rate. The score ranges from 0 to 1. The higher the score, the more similar the pairs of occupations. And we use a threshold or a cutoff of 0.75 to talk about what we consider top transitions. So that's it for the data and the methods. Let's get to the findings. And as I'm going to show on the next slide, one of the first things that really jumped out to us was the high degree of similarity in the skills required for lower wage and better paying jobs. So we often hear about the skills gap, but I think that this table, if it tells us anything, it tells us that skills can be viewed as a bridge rather than as a gap. So the table lists the 20 most in-demand skills. These are the 20 skills most often requested by employers during our study period in the online job advertisements we studied. And they're ranked from 1 to 20 overall. The overall intensity is simply the percentage of job ads that requested a given skill. But then the table also ranks them for lower wage occupations and opportunity occupations individually. And if they fall in the top 10 for any of those subsets of jobs, I've shaded them dark orange. And I would guess that the first thing that pops out to you is that the first 6 skills are top 10 for both lower wage and opportunity occupations. You know, these are what some people call soft skills or 21st century skills, like communication, customer service, collaboration, and teamwork. But the table, our research says that these skills aren't just transferable from one job to another, but they're transferable from one set of lower wage jobs to another set of better paying jobs. Now this table, it's very abstract in that it conveys the results of our research on a national level. Nobody works in the national labor market, right? You know, we all have specific jobs, and when we look at specific pairs, we're going to see differences. You wouldn't expect that carpenters and registered nurses would need the same skills. But as this next slide illustrates, we did find what we call top transitions in every metro. And here's an example. So this chart shows the skills required for sales representatives of services and retail salespersons in the Phoenix metro. Where the skill is required for both occupations, it's the bar is shaded blue. And you're going to see there are a lot of blue bars on this chart, especially the skills that are most important, the skills that have the highest, that are requested most often for this better paying sales representative of services jobs. The skills gap or the training opportunity, the skills that are only required for the better paying job are shaded orange. And you can see that there's less orange than there is blue. So we have skills like marketing, Microsoft Excel, Microsoft Office. But because there's more blue than orange, we have a very high similarity score. In the call out box, you can see the similarity score is around 0.86. And if a worker could sort of fill in these skills gaps, attain or acquire these skills shaded in orange, and successfully transition to a sales representative of services, they would see their salary more than double in Phoenix. So this is but one example. We found almost 4,100 across the 33 metros that we studied. And what I think is even more encouraging is in these metro areas, we found that almost half of lower wage employment can be paired with at least one top transition. So I'll ask you to focus on the top bar in this chart. And what the top bar shows is that 25% of lower wage jobs can be paired with another lower wage job that pays at least 10% more. 12% can be paired with at least one opportunity occupation, and another 12% can be paired with at least one of each of those types of jobs. And I think I've mentioned twice now that in order to be classified as a top transition, the difference between the origin and the destination pay has to be at least 10%. But what we find is much more substantial wage increases, as this table shows. So I'll ask you to look at the bottom row in this table. You can see that overall, these 4,100 top transitions, if they were to be actualized by workers, would represent an increase in average annual median wages of almost 50%, from $30,000 to just under $45,000. In the second row, you can see that the largest relative wage gains would be for workers who could transition from a lower wage job to these better paying opportunity occupations. You can see the percent increase at 78%. So I'd like to close my comments right before I demo the tool that we've developed by talking about some strategies that I think could help workers make these transitions, but also meet the needs of employers at the same time. And Ashley alluded to these as well. And the first is skills-based hiring, which I think could expand applicant pools to include workers who don't have a bachelor's degree and who might be currently excluded under current hiring practices, but who have many of the skills required to do the job. For this to be effective, I think both workers and employers have to recognize that skills are portable, not just from pairs of obviously similar jobs, but from jobs that may not look that similar on the surface. But I think the onus is more on the employer than the worker here. I think it requires that employers identify the skills they need for a given job, create the job description around those skills, and then assess applicants on those skills when filling open positions, rather than assuming that somebody with a certain credential has the skills and somebody without that credential doesn't. I've talked about the similarity score in our research, but I've never suggested that any of these pairs of occupations are identical. They're very similar, but they're not identical. So targeted training could provide otherwise qualified workers with the skills they need to make a transition successfully. So if you think back to that earlier slide, targeted training could help turn those orange bars blue and again, allow the worker to acquire the skills they need to make that transition successfully. And that training could be conducted by employers in-house. It could be at a community college or elsewhere, but of course, collaboration between employers, education providers, workforce development organizations, all of the actors involved would be important to make sure that the training that's being delivered meets the demand of employers. So our web team created a tool called the Occupational Mobility Explorer because, like I mentioned, we found 4,100 top transitions. You can only say so much in a 30-page report. So this tool helps us make the results of our research interactive. And so I'm going to just quickly demo the tool. And I think Ashley's going to drop a link to the tool into the chat. The tool has 3 tabs at the top: build your path, compare skills, and view top transitions. You're going to notice I'm looking off camera because I'm going to use a second monitor to run through the tool. We're going to start with the build your path tab. And I mentioned that we studied 33 metros. I'll just focus on Philadelphia because that's where Ashley and I work. And I'm going to select an origin occupation called helpers of installation, maintenance, and repair workers. It's essentially an assistant maintenance worker position. When I say start path, what happens is you'll see information on the origin you selected, information like the number of jobs, the annual median wages, how we classify that job, whether it's lower wage or an opportunity occupation, and then the national projected growth rate. And then you'll see information on the 10 occupations in Philadelphia that have the highest similarity score to the origin, and they're listed in the first destination column. If I scroll down, you could see information on all 10. We'll stay at the top because that's where the most similar occupations live. And you can see that for this first occupation, maintenance and repair workers in general, we have a very high similarity score of 0.86. Some parallel information like number of jobs and annual median wages, but it also shows the wage increase that a worker could experience moving from the origin to the destination. Now, it's not overly surprising that a helper of a maintenance worker would have a lot of skills in common with a full-fledged maintenance worker. We'll add that occupation to the path. And you'll see that's an iterative process. So now that we've added an occupation as the first destination, the second destination jobs are those that have the most skills in common with the first destination. So you can see that industrial machinery and mechanics has a really high similarity score. We'll add that to the path. And it goes out 4 steps to 3 destinations. And essentially what you can see for this particular pathway is that a worker who starts as a helper making $31,000 an hour per year, after time in the job, building their skills, maybe pursuing some additional education, maybe some additional certifications or certificates, can move through a pathway, building on the skills, leveraging the skills they've developed, and end in an occupation that pays roughly $66,000. It's worth mentioning that this last occupation, aircraft mechanics and service technicians, is an occupation in which women and Black workers are underrepresented. So I'm going to start a second path, again, just to demonstrate that this research isn't specific to manual labor or blue-collar jobs. And I'll select, again in Philadelphia, a large service sector job like cashiers. And you'll remember on an earlier slide, that women, Black workers, and Hispanic workers are all overrepresented in this occupation. The first destination with the highest score is customer service representatives. I'll add that to the path. I'm going to scroll down just a little bit and select securities, commodities, and financial services sales agents, or you might call them stockbrokers or financial advisors. Add them to the path, and we end with supervisors of non-retail sales workers. Now, I chose this particular pathway because I think it's a good example of how additional education to become a financial advisor or additional experience in a supervisory position might be required to follow this pathway. But that education, that training would stop short of a bachelor's degree. Again, someone who begins as a cashier, investing the time and the skills attainment necessary to follow the pathway could go from a salary of $15,000 to roughly $91,000. And again, as before, it's true that women, Black, and Hispanic workers are all underrepresented in this supervisors of non-retail sales workers. So you've probably noticed the compare skills button on each of these cards. You can look at the comparison of skills in this tab, but I'm going to go to a second tab that we developed just to give this a little bit more real estate. Let's stay in Philadelphia. We can choose a more white collar or professional occupation, bill and account collectors and credit counselors. When we say compare skills, the application shows you at the top of the screen skills that are required for both occupations. Again, it shows the percentage of job ads in which the skill is requested. And as we scroll down, in orange, like on the prior chart, there are 6 skills listed that are required for credit counselors, but are not required for bill and account collectors. So again, much like with the prior chart in Phoenix, you can think of these as training opportunities or skills gaps, but these might be the skills that employers are looking for in a bill and account collector that they could build and grow in order to make this a transition successfully. And then the last tab I'll show, the View Top Transitions tab. This one's pretty straightforward. You can select any metro area, and it lists all of the top transitions for that metro. You can see in Charlotte there are 94. You can sort by the increased destination employment, whatever you like. You can view all 4,100 at a time if you care to do that, and then download them all as an Excel spreadsheet. So let me toggle back to my presentation and just thank everyone for their time and attention, and I look forward to the conversation during the Q&A.
All right. Well, thank you, Keith and Ashley. That was excellent. It's a really cool tool. So we did have a couple of questions come in, but one thing I wanted to ask was, you were mentioning looking at changing things like education requirements, and I think that was almost inevitable, given some of the cost barriers and the direction higher education has been going in terms of competition from non-traditional learning sources. But I'm kind of curious about how we source information from candidates. Do you think maybe it's time we start to rethink not only what we expect to see on a resume, but the resume itself as a tool for gathering information?
Sure. I was going to say there's lots of conversation now about how do we measure skills and competencies that may not actually be captured in a resume. So we assume that job seekers can, explain what they're capable of doing, but there's many ways that you can test for a competency that might not actually be visible on that initial resume. And so one of the things that Keith's research has raised for me is how much are we predicting people's potential based on just the industry that they have been in and the job title they have been in. And so I think there's some questions there about, like, how do you test for communication? How do you test for good writing skills? How do you test for conflict management, right? Those are things that are really desired across different job categories. And I think there are some innovative technologies that are coming out that are trying to measure competencies and skills in new ways. I'm interested to see kind of where the field moves, because I think there is this desire across the board from both employers and workers to better be able to articulate and signal what those skills people are that they have that are beyond simply having or not having a degree, or have you worked in this exact field and this exact title. I'll point to one example that I really love. There's an employer in upstate New York called Optimax. They're a firm that does, I believe, manufacturing. And one of the things they shared early on, and I think there's a case study on them, is that they found that people who had worked in the kitchen were actually very good in these manufacturing jobs. And it was because of how you think about combining parts and putting things together. And that would never have been a group of people where they would have said, oh, I'm going to hire, someone who used to be a cook to come and work in this industry. And so to me, that's a great example of who are we missing out on, who would actually be extremely talented and incredible in our workforce simply because we're matching to job title or industry or filter to that degree.
I'll just follow up by saying I think Ashley makes some really good points, and in time, because it's going to take, I think, a while for us to sort of transition away from resumes. There's some interesting tools available that can help workers build resumes based on the skills they have. So there's a resume tool builder offered by the Rework America Alliance, and it allows workers to input prior positions, prior occupations that they've had, and it sort of pre-populates their resume with skills and tasks that the typical worker in those jobs would be responsible for. And it allows the job seeker to sort of customize the resume, so they can add other tasks or skills that they want included. Not only that, but if the job seeker is applying for a specific position, the resume builder will help identify areas of overlap so that the job seeker can emphasize the skills and the tasks that are required for the new position. And I think in that way, we can think about the resume as a hybrid. So it's sort of a traditional tool, but can be rethought to help workers and employers appreciate the skills overlap, and maybe consider those or weight those either equally or more heavily than traditional credentials.
Interesting. Very interesting. Okay. So this question came in from Jennifer. She asked, what are 2 significant steps a company can make to move in this direction if they're at ground zero, in terms of making changes of how they view their employees and evaluate skills?
Sure. I think so. We've had some conversations in Philadelphia about, how do companies move into sort of skills-based hiring and skills-based assessments? And honestly, it really does vary, right? Like you can't pretend like this is one size fits all. Obviously, everyone listening today are in really different industries. The kinds of skills and talents you need are really different, and the way you can assess those are really different. But one of the things they identified across the board is just identify places where you're using credentials to filter that maybe you don't want to. So that's one of the questions on the way in. And then start thinking about opportunities you have internally where there may be some of those, and again, I would check out the Occupational Mobility Explorer, some of those job similarities that you may not even assume exist in your organization. So are there places where we could be investing in, maybe someone has the communication skills, but needs a little bit more training in a technical skill. And so I think those are some great examples of, I know there are a lot of employers that are starting to think through this. And you may have already done this as an employer, but I think for me, the first step is trying to identify places where we're creating artificial barriers, and then trying to identify opportunities. Because really, in any organization, there are tons of opportunities. And then maybe the third step is thinking beyond your own organization. And I know that's the hardest part, because as HR representatives, we're inclined to, we want to keep our people. But there's always a question to me of like, if you were to walk through this Occupational Mobility Explorer and find that someone in your staff would actually really transition to an amazing high-paying job that you don't have, what are ways that you're ensuring that they're developing those skills, whether they are staying or not staying at your organization?
Yeah, and I'll just say, and I think this, maybe this is more specific and was covered by Ashley's comments, but I think it starts with the job description. I think, at least it's true, I think in my employer and previous employers, that job descriptions sometimes can be set in stone and not rethought from year to year or from opening to opening. And just looking at a job description with fresh eyes and trying to figure out what, does it really list the skills that that a new person would need for this position? Do we know that the educational requirements that we've also attached to this job description guarantee the worker has those skills? And are there better ways to determine that? And I think that's just a sort of a nuts and bolts place that I would start.
All right. Well, folks, we got about 5 minutes left. Don't hesitate to drop a few more questions in the chat. But I'm curious, about some of the insights that you all have kind of uncovered using the tool. What are some of the things that you found interesting, and how much do things vary by metro? Because you've got 33 different cities, and I imagine they all kind of have a unique, I guess we'll call it a footprint in the tool. So I'm just curious your thoughts on that.
Yeah, so we wanted to, when we started the research, we thought it was really important, and we still think it's important, to look at the skills that are demanded in a local labor market, right? Because, an IT professional in Silicon Valley might need a different skill set than an IT professional in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. The industry mix is different, so the jobs, even though there are 800 occupations, that seems like a lot, but they're still pretty broad, and there's a variety of work that can be done within each. So we thought it was important to focus on the local skills that are required. What we found was that by and large, occupations do look fairly similar across places, by and large. So if you work in a metropolitan area that's not represented in the tool, I think you're on fairly safe ground to pick a metro like yours, whether it's nearby geographically or share some of the same characteristics, roughly the same size or wage levels. And you can learn something from the tool, I think, in that regard. One thing that's been surprising to us is that I think some of the most keen interest in the tool has been sort of for job exploration for students and workers. So I think when we did the research and developed the tool, we were thinking about employers and community colleges and the workforce development sector sort of as a whole, that ecosystem as being the primary audience for it. We've gotten a lot more interest from career counselors who are helping high school students or community college students think through how they could go from one job to another and what skills they would need to build. So we were thinking macro, and a lot of the use cases have been more micro. And we've heard a number of times that it could be inspirational or optimistic for a low-wage worker to see the tool and realize that there's a way out, that they don't have to get stuck, assuming that there are employers on the other end who can evaluate and appreciate the skills they've developed in those lower-wage jobs.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think one of my biggest takeaways from the research initially was just again, that narrative we often have on workers in low-wage jobs, that we often speak about them as if they are low-skilled. And I think what we're finding from this work is that is definitively not the case, that people, possess a whole variety of skills. And, the more we talk about this, the more cases we've heard. We had a conference a few years ago where people stepped up and said, yeah, I worked in the frontline service industry, and I can tell you all sorts of varieties of skills that I developed from that work that have persisted throughout my career. And so I think for me, there's a really important finding from this work in terms of those similarities that maybe we need to challenge how we think about workers as sort of, well, they're stuck because of the skill. What we're learning is actually they do have a lot of them. So what are the other things that are preventing people from accessing those opportunities? So I really thought the work was pretty illuminating in terms of the potential and assets that people already bring to the labor market.
Yeah, and I think it's an interesting time to kind of explore this because, we talk all the time in HR about how work is being automated in different ways. And so a lot of work is becoming more human. Well, who has a lot of that human-to-human interaction experience? It is a lot of these workers that have been on the front lines and been dealing with people. So I think it's an interesting time to reconsider, what kind of skills we value and why we value them. Well,
yeah, one of our hopes is that in this moment in the pandemic, people have been home, and they've kind of gone, all right, well, this job got shut down, this business closed. What else can I connect to? And so I think to Keith's point, there's actually a lot of interest from job seekers and education providers because people are making those transitions. And so that's been really interesting to me as well.
Well, I think I'm going to plug my information into the tool and see what happens. So now I'm curious. No, Ashley, Keith, I want to thank you for joining us today. We have a little less than a minute left, so I'm going to go ahead and wrap up the session. But thank you for this. This was really informative and very interesting stuff. I think we have a lot of people who are checking out the tool right now and are very interested in it. So very cool.
Thank you for having us. It's a pleasure.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks for having us.
All right, everyone. So if you just click on the agenda widget off to your left-hand side there, you can get over back to your agenda and find the link to the next session. And I'll see you over there in about 15 minutes. All right.